Today's topic is a very expensive project that could make the United States worse off, even if the entire thing were free. You may have heard about a nuclear shield that the United States wants to construct. It's called the Golden Dome, and it has been all over the place in the news for the last week or so. What you're watching right now is a sizzle reel from the Trump administration about its virtues. And while I assure you that we will have more relaxing and calming images to look at as we discuss more about the Golden Dome project, and again, some of those things are going to be nuclear explosions, so maybe not all that calming, but nevertheless slower paced, it's important that we do talk about it, because there is a risk that the Golden Dome could backfire. And I'm not just talking about because of cost overruns. Cost overruns have been discussed at length before. I'm talking about a genuine backfire risk, where the United States not only fails to achieve its objectives in the construction of the Golden Dome, but actually ends up in a worse position than before it was ever built. So today, I'm going to focus on three types of problems: technical problems, strategic problems, and political problems. The technical side of this has been discussed at length elsewhere, so I'm going to be quickest with that subset of those issues. And I'm going to spend most of that time focusing on what the Golden Dome is designed to do, which will then take us into the other pair of problems, the political problems and the strategic problems with the system. And some good news, there will be plenty of lines on maps along the way. But we start with the technological problems, and really this conversation goes back to the 1980s and the Ronald Reagan administration. You may be familiar with something known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, or as it became popularly known, Star Wars. If you think back during this time period, Star Wars was becoming a cultural phenomenon for the first time during the early parts of the Reagan administration. And what the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, attempted to do was effectively put space lasers into space to shoot down nuclear weapons. So very clearly, after that, people wanted to call it Star Wars, and the name stuck. That may be where the comparisons ought to end, though, because the Star Wars franchise made billions of dollars. In comparison, the Reagan Star Wars project cost billions of dollars and didn't really go very far. It turns out that shooting down an intercontinental ballistic missile is not an easy thing to do. These things travel incredibly quickly, and as a result, can go very far distances in not very much time at all. To shoot an ICBM from Russia to the United States, that's not going to take hours. It will be minutes from when the button is pressed in Moscow to when that first nuclear weapon is landing in some major city in the United States. And again, to be blunt here, the technology that the Department of Defense had in the 1980s was just not up to the task. It was not possible to figure out where these things were going in a fast enough time and be able to have missiles reliably intercept them before they can reach their targets. But it is no longer the 1980s, and there is some good news here. Ballistics have not changed much in the 80 to 90 years since the first German V-2 ballistic missiles were used. Yeah, sure, there's going to be some changes in how you are launching these things, the speed at which they're being launched, and how exactly they are coming back down to the Earth. But the science behind ballistics has remained relatively the same. And in further good news, God has not patched gravity in at least a few billion years. So the underlying science behind how these missiles are being fired has stayed relatively constant over time. And in the meantime, there has been a catch-up process on a couple of other fronts. The first of these major revolutions is how much cheaper it is to send stuff into space. Think about the Starlink system for a moment, and we're going to be referring back to this a couple of different times during this video. Starlink has about 7,500 satellites in orbit to be able to provide its service. That is something that would have been completely infeasible 30 or 40 years ago. And now, not only is it feasible today, but this is a for-profit company. This is a company trying to make money. It is now commercially viable to do that sort of thing. When you're thinking about the national security sphere, national security people are not interested in making money. They're interested in trying to protect a particular asset. And so if something is commercially viable like Starlink, it is going to then be militarily viable to have a whole bunch of satellites in orbit as well. The second major difference is in raw computational power. Remember, we are dealing with intercontinental ballistic missiles here. It may only take 25 or 30 minutes for one of those to travel from Russia to the United States. That means there is very little time to 1. Identify that there is a threat, 2. Make the human political decision to shoot down that threat, and 3. Calculate where the interceptor missile needs to go to actually hit the ICBM. Well, you may have some idea about just how advanced things have gotten if you've been watching what's going on between Russia and Ukraine right now. We're at the point where if artillery is fired on the battlefield there, you have radar systems that are littering the area. That artillery piece is going to light up on the radar. And because you have multiple radars here triangulating the position, they're going to be able to figure out where that thing was fired from. And by they, I don't mean humans looking at what's happening with the radar. I mean a computer process is going to see this and immediately zero in on where the artillery piece was. And then you can fire back. And by you firing back, I'm not talking about humans doing the entire process of targeting where their artillery piece is pointing. I'm talking about the computer will automatically know where to fire. And you just need to have a human decide, okay, we need to launch these things, so we have to make sure that our artillery pieces are fully loaded, and then press the button to do so. But all of that calculation, all of that mathematics is taking place behind the scenes, as it were, by a computer. Well, apply that to the Golden Dome, and you're going to have a major revolution in how you are shooting down those ICBMs. Once upon a time, one way you might try to shoot down an ICBM is to launch your own nuclear weapon at the nuclear weapon that is incoming. Why would you want to do that? Well, the saying that close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades is slightly misleading, because when it comes to nuclear weapons, the general vicinity is good enough. Thus, if you are bad at calculating where an ICBM is going to be at any given moment, you don't have to be precise about this with a nuclear weapon that's counteracting the nuclear weapon. You just send up your own nuclear interceptor, and as long as you're in the general vicinity of the ICBM that's incoming, that nuclear detonation goes off, the explosion destroys the ICBM, and you're good, putting air quotes around good here, you're good to go. Now, obviously, this is not sounding like a good solution, because in fact, it's not a good solution, it's a bad solution, but it is still much better than the alternative. If an ICBM actually reaches its target, well, then there goes your city. In contrast, if your nuclear-tipped missile intercepts the ICBM, sure, there is going to be one nuclear explosion. It's not going to be two. It's just going to be the one from your missile that's going off. But where that missile is going off and where that nuclear explosion is taking place is way up in the atmosphere. So what gets irradiated is the atmosphere. That radiation goes all around the world, and you're no longer going to be in a situation where you're losing a city. Perhaps the real problem here is how expensive that interceptor missile will be. Nuclear weapons are very pricey, and so if you're using a nuclear weapon to destroy a nuclear weapon, yeah, you're saving the city, but you're also not doing it in a very efficient manner. So it would be very nice if you could be more precise with where the ICBM is incoming, and then use something that's going to be more of a localized explosion, say perhaps actually hitting the missile itself. And that is where the name Golden Dome is slightly misleading, and the same goes for the visuals that the White House has created about it. A dome makes it sound like there is going to be some sort of shield placed around the United States, and if a missile comes and tries to penetrate that shield, the shield will deny it and the United States will remain safe. Instead, the goal of Golden Dome is to observe when an ICBM is launched, and then attack the ICBM while it is still in the rocket phase of this, while it is still going up, rather than when it is coming down. There are a couple of benefits associated with that. One small point here is that where the interception is going to occur is nowhere near where the target is. But the bigger thing is that when the rocket is going up, there is a literal explosion happening at the time. And we know from various different space launches that those things want to explode, generally, and it is difficult. It is a scientific process to make sure that they don't generally explode, and they just have their propulsion system going and the rocket is going forward rather than having a massive explosion right after takeoff. So you can probably see where the benefit is here. It's relatively easy to convince that thing to explode. You just need to do the bare minimum with the interception to have the entire thing light up, and once it is lit up, that ICBM is no longer going to hit you. The problem with trying to hit an ICBM coming up, though, is that you have to have tons of coverage to be able to hit that ICBM wherever it may be coming from, and you have to rapidly identify that it is coming up to be able to intercept it at that point. Well, what did we talk about just a moment ago in the evolution of technology over the last 40 years? 1, the ability to put more stuff into space, and 2, the ability to calculate trajectories much more quickly than we could before. Put those two things together, and suddenly the Golden Dome sounds feasible, at least to the point where we can have a reasonable conversation about constructing the Golden Dome, as compared to the current world that we live in, where we have interceptors in Alaska trying to find the ICBMs as they are coming down. It is not all technological roses, though, and I think it is fitting that we're talking about a system previously known as Star Wars, given George Lucas and his desire to make unsatisfying sequels. Here we are looking at the estimates of how much it might cost to construct the Golden Dome. According to Trump, it's $175 billion. According to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, it is between $161 and $542 billion. And then at the end, you have a very pessimistic estimate from Senator Tim Sheehy of Montana, a Republican notably, who said that it is going to cost trillions of dollars. But let's just move past that for a moment and think about whether it will work, not in the technological sense, but in the strategic and political senses. We have a template for what the goal is here. In an ideal world, from the United States' perspective, you build your new technology, here the Golden Dome. That forces the other side into submission because they can't afford to keep up with you on these new developments. And then, as a result, you win the broader underlying ideological conflict and Cold War between the two parties. That is, of course, a common narrative for how the first Cold War ended. And it pains me to say this is the first Cold War because it tells you about the current world that we are living in. But the Soviet Union was going through economic problems, and then during the Reagan administration, with all of the ramp up in US defense spending, the Soviet Union had to make a decision. It could continue to fight that economic battle by converting money into military goods to be able to project power and defend against the United States, or it could just say, you know what, this is no longer worth it, and we're going to have a very big change to our political system. As you can see here, what we ended up having was Gorbachev coming into power, and basically just that, reforms to the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. How good of a strategy is that today? Well, that is a good question. The United States should be in good economic position compared to its competitors, but there are a lot of question marks there. The United States is not currently in a recession, but the projections and estimates of the likelihood of a recession in the next year or two have been consistently moving up, especially since the Trump administration announced the Liberation Day tariffs. Now, the implementation of those tariffs has been rather spotty. We've seen a whole bunch of indecision in that regard, where Trump announces one thing, and then there's some conversation between Trump administration officials and China, or Trump administration officials and the European Union, and then there's some sort of timeout placed on the tariffs or some portion of the tariffs. Economic hardship will be unavoidable if the tariffs do come into effect. That is something that many in the Trump administration have openly admitted to, that there will be some sort of recession in the short run, but that the United States will get all sorts of economic benefits in the long run. Well, aside from what you think about that, and we've talked before plenty about what economists think about that and what the stock market thinks about that, but aside from all of that, that still means that trying to implement some sort of economic competition in the military domain, in the form of a Golden Dome and some sort of weapons and arms race that comes along with that, is going to be rather tough for the United States. But the United States is only half of the equation. We still have to talk about what the other main competitors of the United States are doing and what their economies look like. And from that perspective, the relative comparison between the two, the United States still looks relatively good there. China is the peer competitor that is probably in the best shape, but there are still issues there. You can start with the demographics problem. There aren't very many people being born in China, and there isn't much in the way of immigration to make up for that, which then leads to long-run questions about where China's economic growth is going to come from. In the short and medium runs, there are issues with the potential real estate bubble within China. And if that bursts, there's going to be all sorts of spillover effects that endanger the entire financial system. In contrast, the remaining competitors of the United States are in not as good of shape. Russia may somehow be the best of those that remain, but Russia is having to deal with all sorts of economic problems associated with the war in Ukraine. And those might get much, much worse if there is a continued collapse in oil prices. Then you have North Korea and Iran. North Korea with nuclear weapons, and Iran not currently with nuclear weapons, but may have nuclear weapons shortly. We'll return to that point later on in this video toward the end. Those two countries, though, have been under sanctions for my entire political memory. Their economies are a complete mess. So those are the types of countries that would struggle to be able to compete with the United States and adapt to what the Golden Dome might be able to do for US defenses. But let's talk more about what happens if the dream dies and you don't live in this ideal world where the other side gives up. Then what you're going to be looking at in short order are your opponents trying to develop countermeasures to the system that you have deployed. And again, we have historical parallels of what that looks like. Go back to the original era of missile defense. One adaptation that Russia developed in that time period was something known as Multiple Independent Reentry Vehicles, or MIRVs for short. This is where you would have a single ICBM go up into the atmosphere, and then once it gets up there and it's on its way down, when it is re-entering, you have multiple independent reentry vehicles. Again, that's the acronym. So the missile effectively deploys a bunch of warheads that independently go to different areas after that. Which means that if you're trying to shoot down the missile, you're not shooting down one ICBM. You're shooting down a whole bunch of different weapons that have come out of a single ICBM. And that is designed to overwhelm the system. And there's a nice parallel there to adaptations regarding the Iron Dome system that Israel runs. Iron Dome is similar to the Golden Dome in the sense that they're both trying to shoot down missiles, but it's a very different scope of a problem for Israel. Israel has a relatively small amount of territory and is facing a regional threat, whereas the Golden Dome is facing a global threat and has to cover a much larger and expansive region of territory in the United States. And that's assuming that it's just the United States that the United States is ultimately protecting. There's also been discussions about getting other countries involved in this, especially Canada. Nonetheless, the clear parallel with MIRVs and Israel's opponents' adaptations is that Israel is facing a whole bunch of missiles coming in all at the same time, some of them armed with dummy warheads. And the Iron Dome can only handle so many missiles at once, which means you're left with a situation where some of those missiles are coming through, and some of them may in fact be real warheads that will deal real damage. And thus, it is possible that what you end up getting with these systems is both sides running faster and faster, only to stay in the same place. One side spends a bunch of money to do something, the other side spends a bunch of money that completely counteracts it, or mostly counteracts it. And so the shift in the balance of power is basically nothing or close to nothing ultimately, but everyone has spent a whole bunch of money in the process. Okay, then let's talk about some of the problems that come along with that as it relates to Golden Dome. Remember, what Golden Dome attempts to do is find missiles as they are being shot up, and then shoot them down even before they reach the apex of their trajectory. One solution, then, that Russia may seek to implement is to effectively pull the same counter strategy as Iron Dome and overwhelm the Golden Dome's defenses. So rather than firing a handful of nuclear weapons, you double or triple or 10 times the amount, and suddenly the Golden Dome system is unable to handle all of that at once. So yes, it's possible that Golden Dome will shoot down a handful of them, but as long as a few make it past the system, then in terms of the actual damage that you're producing at the end, you're still getting the desired result. That, of course, is not free for Russia. To overwhelm the system, you need to have more nuclear weapons. Right now, Russia has about 4,000 or so nuclear weapons on hand. This is way down from the peak of the Cold War, when it was around 40,000. So a whole order of magnitude fewer number of nuclear weapons now than, say, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Half of the reason why Moscow cut down on the number of active Russian nuclear weapons is because they are expensive to build and maintain. And when you're in a period of relative relaxation between the United States and Russia, because the Cold War is over, then spending all of that money to have another 36,000 nuclear weapons is not a very good idea. It's financially unwise. So you get rid of them. But the Golden Dome is here, maybe in the future. What do you have to do? If you want to counteract it, you need to get those nuclear weapons fired back up. That's expensive. But imagine for a moment that Russia can indeed afford to do this and chooses to do it, that it's actively in Russia's best interest to respond to Golden Dome in that way. Think about the consequences of this to the United States. Well, the other main reason why the number of nuclear weapons has dropped down so far in the last few decades is that the more nuclear weapons there are out there, the greater the risk there is that one of those nuclear weapons will fall into the hands of some sort of rogue element. And maybe that rogue element will not be able to launch the nuclear weapon properly, but there's all sorts of hazardous gunk and materials inside of a nuclear weapon. And if you just get your hands on a weapon by itself, you could turn that relatively easily into a dirty bomb. That's a concern for Moscow, yes, because the nuclear weapons are inside of Russia. But it's also a concern for the United States. There's no guarantee that a militant group inside of Russia with a nuclear weapon on hand is going to use that nuclear weapon against Russia. It may use that nuclear weapon against Western interests, including the United States. Put differently, Russia scaling up the number of nuclear weapons imposes a negative externality on the United States. And in turn, it is possible that the construction of the Golden Dome ultimately leaves the United States in a worse position. Why? Well, if Russia's extra nuclear weapons are offsetting the benefits of the Golden Dome, then there is no change in the relative balance of power between the two of them. There are going to be costs paid by both sides to construct the new nuclear weapons for Russia, as well as the Golden Dome for the United States. But even if those costs were free, even if the United States didn't have to worry about the costs of the Golden Dome, the fact that there are these negative externalities imposed on the United States by Russia constructing new nuclear weapons means that the Golden Dome in this hypothetical scenario is a net loss for the United States. Regardless of how that calculation breaks down, the whole concern about countermeasures indicates that where the United States is going to get the most benefit from the Golden Dome is not going to be against a country like Russia that already has a lot of nuclear weapons and could potentially expand on the number of nuclear weapons that it has relatively quickly. Where it's going to get extra benefit are countries that are against the United States and don't have very many nuclear weapons. Iran is a good starting point on this, even though Iran does not yet have a nuclear weapon. And furthermore, if Iran were to construct a nuclear weapon sometime soon, there is a big difference between having a nuclear weapon on hand and miniaturizing a nuclear weapon to go into an ICBM that could be fired on the United States. And furthermore, not only do you have to miniaturize it, you also need to make sure that the nuclear weapon is relatively robust and will not fall apart as it is going up into space and then coming back down. A lot of hurdles to go through there before Iran is actually a threat, but you can understand why Golden Dome would be so effective against Iran. If Iran only has a handful of nuclear weapons, then the United States can effectively ignore them if the United States has a functioning Golden Dome. And indeed, it is almost certainly the case that if and when Iran develops a nuclear weapon, that Iran will not be able to accelerate that program very quickly. So for a long period of time, the United States can basically treat Iran as though it is a de facto non-nuclear weapon state. Of course, that's not going to be exactly reassuring to other countries in Iran's region, say Saudi Arabia and Israel. But from the United States' perspective, where the United States is capable of defending itself, well, that's a pretty good argument for why you might want to build it and invest the costs associated with it. And it is also easy to forget that this whole conversation dates all the way back to the George W. Bush administration. Yeah, way back then in the early 2000s. Bush wanted to develop missile defense, primarily in Europe, but also generally speaking, to have some sort of system there to stop Iranian missiles from striking their targets. This was before it became, prime time for a potential Iranian nuclear weapon program to be completed, but that sort of threat was still lingering in the background. And meanwhile, guess who was objecting to it at the time? It was Russia, just like today. Why? Because once you have a missile defense shield that's constructed to defend yourself against Iranian weapons, those missile defense systems can also work against Russian systems. So Russia has a reason to be concerned about that too. Interestingly, what stopped that from going forward was the US invasion of Afghanistan. The United States needed supply routes going into the country, and Russia could help out with that. Of course, the Kremlin asked for something in return, and what we ended up seeing was a timeout on missile defense. So it is important to think about this in the big picture, and also not to just focus on a single country, whether it's Russia or Iran, or perhaps another one. Basically, all of that same logic holds for North Korea, except North Korea already has nuclear weapons, and so it is a current danger for the United States. The last country worth mentioning here, of course, is China. China has about 500 nuclear weapons at the moment, but is looking to expand up to 1,000. So some of the benefits associated with Golden Dome might be offset by the doubling of Chinese nuclear weapons. But that's still a long distance away from Russia's 4,000 nuclear weapons, or the level of nuclear weapons that the Soviet Union had during the Cold War. There are other solutions to the Golden Dome problem beyond overwhelming the system. Another way you might go about solving the problem is just destroying the system itself. You can't use a Star Wars system, this Golden Dome, if the Golden Dome satellites don't exist either. So an alternative solution from Russia's perspective is not to invest more in nuclear weapons, but invest in anti-satellite technology, ways of shooting down satellites in orbit, so that if Russia does want to launch a nuclear strike, step 1 is destroy the Golden Dome system, step 2 is to then use the nuclear weapons. However, the most damning argument against the Golden Dome is that countries can use alternative delivery mechanisms. Get rid of those ICBMs, and use something that the Golden Dome cannot hit. Moreover, those sorts of alternative delivery mechanisms already exist. Russia, for example, has submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Those things live aboard submarines that stay very quiet toward the bottom of the ocean until they are called upon to come to the surface and launch a nuclear weapon from nearby where the target is. Thus, they are not going to go all the way up into space, where the Golden Dome system might be able to recognize them and shoot them out of the air. Instead, they're going to be nearby and have a quicker launch and a quicker detonation onto a US city. And actually, that's the whole point behind having a nuclear triad. Having nuclear-equipped bombers, having ICBMs, and having SLBMs. If in the event your opponent renders 2 of those options irrelevant, either publicly or privately, you still have a third, and the third is capable of delivering enough pain to punish and coerce the other side and deter the other side from taking actions that you do not like. It may, in the future, force Russia to make some decisions about how to allocate its nuclear weapons to which delivery systems, namely here, reducing the number of ICBMs they have and increasing the number of SLBMs. But nonetheless, that is a much easier solution from Russia's perspective than developing a fresh and brand new delivery system that they have no experience with. Thus, recapping this segment of the video, the United States may get some sort of benefit associated with developing the Golden Dome system. But what those long-run benefits are may be relatively small. Once opponents start developing countermeasures that render the Golden Dome effectively moot, the United States has spent a lot of money and not gotten much of a return on the investment. And that is why I said earlier, what you could have with these sorts of new systems is a lot of running just to stay in the same place, but cost mounting along with that in the meantime. And if you are thinking to yourself, gee, costs are bad, wouldn't it be great if we could negotiate a resolution which would be relatively efficient by comparison? Then that makes for a great transition to our next topic, which is how a system like Golden Dome affects whether wars start or not. And I think it is worth framing this discussion with 2 separate arguments that you may hear whenever Golden Dome comes up. Neither one of these is going to be internally consistent when we think about the strategic logic that underlies both of them. And it's going to be apparent once we start getting into, and yes, I'm going to say the words now, once we start getting into the lines on maps. The first is that it's a defensive system, and the second is that it will lead to nuclear war. Putting those two next to each other is funny because they seem to be inconsistent when combined together. But again, The problem with each of them really is that they are inconsistent internally on their own. Let's start with the defensive system part. You may hear something along the lines of, no country should resist the United States developing the Golden Dome because it is an inherently defensive system. The United States cannot use it to shoot at other countries. All the Golden Dome can do is prevent other countries from shooting at the United States. It protects U.S. citizens, it protects U.S. property. It does not destroy other countries' property, it does not kill other countries' citizens, and thus no country should resist the United States developing it. After all, if any country were to object, then implicitly they are saying that they have plans to shoot at the United States, because the Golden Dome is only going to prevent countries from shooting at the United States, and thus if a country has no plan to shoot at the United States, then the Golden Dome system is inherently irrelevant. Meanwhile, that second point about nuclear war is referencing mutually assured destruction. This is the idea that two countries with relatively large and stable nuclear arsenals are unlikely to fight a nuclear war against one another, and perhaps unlikely to start a conventional war against each other either. The idea being here is that if country 1 fires nuclear weapons at country 2, then country 2, having a stable stockpile of nuclear weapons, will still have enough left over to fire back at country 1 and cause a whole bunch of damage to country 1. In turn, looking down the interaction, country 1 is deterred from initiating the nuclear war in the first place. And this works vice versa as well. Country 2 is deterred from initiating a nuclear war against country 1 because country 1 has nuclear weapons it can fire back at country 2. And to some degree, this may apply to conventional wars as well, if you are worried that starting a conventional war might raise the risk of nuclear accident, or alternatively, may risk having some sort of runaway nuclear escalation, then you don't get involved in the war in the first place. We will see that there is some good logic behind this idea when we get to the lines on maps in a moment, but we really need to think further about what exactly the Golden Dome is doing to manipulate the bargaining incentives between the two parties. And what better way to do that than with some classic lines on maps? I'll be using Russia and Western Europe as an illustrative example here, but the same logic will apply to other countries as well. Quick reminder, the white line represents the hypothetical expected outcome between two parties if they fight a war, whereas the space between the yellow and the white lines represents how much in costs that Western Europe would pay if they were to fight the war, and meanwhile, the space between the white and the red lines represents Russia's costs if they fight a war. Now, again, the central question for us is what does the Golden Dome do to affect these sorts of incentives? And there are two clear answers to that. For one thing, what is the primary purpose of the Golden Dome? In other words, if you just asked people who are making this, what does it literally do? The answer is that it shoots down incoming missiles and protects Western cities from whatever is going to be destroyed by those missiles. So instead of that missile landing on Washington, D.C. or New York, or perhaps a Western European country, it gets shot down even before it reaches the apex of its flight. Okay, well, remember that the difference between the yellow and the white lines is the cost that the Western coalition in this hypothetical scenario might pay if they fight a war. If the missiles are not going to be reaching their target, then the costs that are going to be paid by the West are going to be smaller. Second, it ought to affect the expected outcome of the war. If Russian nuclear weapons are going to be destroying US cities or Western European cities, it's also perfectly feasible for those weapons to destroy materiel as well. That means that the West ought to calculate a better expected outcome if a war breaks out. Likewise, if all that is actually being targeted are the cities, that's going to do massive economic damage. And if you're thinking about this in terms of a long war, then the more massive economic damage is dealt, the less ability that the Western European governments and the United States will have to be able to fight that long war. All of that is saying that the expected outcome of a war looks more favorable from the Western perspective once the Golden Dome is up and running. Okay, what does that mean for what we've drawn here? Well, let's remember how these are drawn in the first place. The space between the white and the red lines represents Russia's expected costs of fighting a war. That means that the red line is drawn a certain distance away from the white line. And likewise, the yellow line is drawn a certain distance away from the white line. If we think that the Western coalition becomes more likely to win a war, that means the white line is going to shift over, as well as the red line being shifted further back, because, once more, the red line is a certain distance away from the white line. So, to state that differently, the white line moving pushes the red line an equal distance further back. The other difference, of course, is that if the West is going to be paying fewer costs, that yellow line is going to get closer to the white line. So all of this put together means that we're going to be seeing shifts going way, way to the east, with the yellow line getting closer to the white line, and the white line moving further away from the west and toward the east, and the red line also being pushed back in that direction. And now it should be evident why a country like Russia would be unenthusiastic about the Golden Dome being created. Think again about that yellow line. That yellow line represents the bare minimum that the Western coalition needs to be willing to accept a deal and not wish to fight a conflict. Well, that yellow line has shifted to the east for two reasons. Again, because the costs of war have gone down, and as well, because the expected outcome of the war now looks more favorable from the Western European perspective. All of that means that the West is going to hold firmer in negotiations and demand extra concessions out of Russia. Or, to phrase it differently, Russia becomes less capable of extorting the West. Think about all of the various things the Western coalition puts up with in regard to Russia. Interference in Western elections, various sabotage operations coming from who knows where, the various restrictions that the West has put on Ukraine and how Ukraine fights a war with Western materiel against Russia. All of those things are things that the West is not particularly enthusiastic about, but puts up with it because there are escalation concerns with Russia. Well, once the West has access to the Golden Dome, the West is going to suddenly become more reluctant to allow those sort of sabotage operations to go unpunished. And likewise, the West can drop all sorts of restrictions on Ukraine's use of weapons because, well, what is Russia going to do in response? Fire missiles at the West? Nice try, but the Golden Dome will shoot those down. Thus, the central lesson here, and this goes well beyond the Golden Dome, is that defensive weapon systems provide their owners with additional coercive power. This is, in effect, an insurance policy. Once you are insured from the attacks coming from the opponent because of your missile defense system or whatever, you become more inclined to take risks, and you have credible threats to fight where you did not have credible threats to fight before. The opponent internalizes those threats and thus has to back down under circumstances that they were unwilling to back down from before. And that logic provides some insight into that second issue from earlier, that the Golden Dome system is going to result in a nuclear war. The main effect of a Golden Dome is to shift the balance of power in one's favor and reduce the costs associated with fighting. That is it. Those are the primary effects. Indeed, as long as there are no bargaining frictions between the two parties, all a new weapon system does is alter the terms of a settlement. It does not change the fact that there still exists a range of settlements that are mutually preferable to war. All it does is change the location of those settlements in a way that is favorable to the country that owns the new weapon system. Moreover, the idea that the only reason that the United States does not fire nuclear weapons against Russia is because Russia can fire nuclear weapons at the United States is insane. Mutually assured destruction is not necessary for the persistence of nuclear non-use. Think about the United States fighting a war, an active war, rather than just having tensions between the two countries, but the United States fighting an active war against Afghanistan, or Iraq, or Serbia, or Panama, or Vietnam. Or maybe think about the United Kingdom fighting a war against Argentina, or Russia fighting a war against Georgia, or Russia fighting a war against Ukraine. Those are all circumstances where there were active battles ongoing between a nuclear-armed country and a non-nuclear-armed country. And let me just check my notes real quick. Nope. Not a single use of nuclear weapons in any of those cases. It turns out that there are a whole bunch of other reasons why you might not want to use nuclear weapons in the event of war. So just because the United States magically has some sort of technology that cancels out Russia's ability to use nuclear weapons, or China's, or North Korea's, or potentially Iran's, doesn't suddenly mean that the United States is going to start launching nuclear weapons at the target. That does not rule out the possibility that the Golden Dome system might affect the likelihood of war between two parties. But it does mean that we need to think about how the Golden Dome affects bargaining frictions to have some sort of understanding about a mechanism for conflict there. And one possibility should be immediately concerning. We are talking about how Golden Dome will shift the balance of power between the two parties. Well, anytime that comes into the conversation, you get a preventive war incentive. Preventive war is when a declining state looks into the future and realizes that once the balance of power has shifted unfavorably against it, then it is going to have to make additional concessions to the rising state to convince the rising state not to want to fight. And it will be in the best interest of the declining state at that point to make those concessions, otherwise it's stuck paying the costs of war. However, in the present, before the shift in the balance of power has happened, it is possible that the declining state will choose to fight a war now. That is because, even though in the future there is going to be a deal done, that deal, despite its efficiency, is going to result in a lot of concessions made by the declining state to the rising state. And it's possible that fighting a war in the present, under a relatively favorable balance of power, even though that is costly to the declining state, will produce a better outcome to the declining state in expectation than what happens after it gives up all of those concessions in the future. What that might look like here would be something along the lines of Russia shooting down the Golden Dome satellites before Golden Dome becomes operational, or more directly going after the launch sites in the United States to prevent any of those satellites from getting up there in the first place. China could execute the same type of strategy if China thought that it would be a good idea. It'd be much more difficult for North Korea or Iran to apply preventive measures, simply because North Korea and Iran don't have the same capacity to project power that Russia and China do. Even if we make it through that segment without any incident, we're not necessarily in the clear. There will be a second window of opportunity potentially coming up afterward. Earlier in the video, we talked about how once the Golden Dome is operational, the opponents are going to try to come up with countermeasures to it. And it's possible that there is a moment where the United States has the full protection of the Golden Dome, but is going to be concerned that in the near future, Russia or China or someone else will have developed the technology to override the Golden Dome. Well, that gives the United States a lot of incentive to push the issue in that particular moment before Russia and China can threaten the United States, knowing that in the future, the threat to the United States will return. And as a final point here, it is worth noting that for most bargaining frictions, having a lower overall cost of war incentivizes greater risks to be run in bargaining. So if you think that the Golden Dome is just going to insulate the United States from costs, what that does, for example, with Ukraine, is give the United States and the West a little bit more leverage to allow Ukraine to have open access to US weapons to use against Russia. The United States knows that by doing so, there is some risk that it will break Russia's true red line. However, at the same time, the United States realizes that the Golden Dome is going to protect it, and thus the costs associated with having Russia fight back are lower, which means that the United States is more likely and willing to run that risk than was the case previously. Meanwhile, we need to discuss the possibility of wars occurring for non-strategic reasons, and there is a major concern here. One of the debates in nuclear strategy is counterforce versus counter-value targeting. Close your eyes for a second and think about a nuclear weapon going off with immense detail about where it is and what's getting destroyed. I am guessing when you do that exercise, you are probably thinking about a city being destroyed. If so, then what you have in your mind when you're thinking about nuclear war is counter-value targeting. Cities are valuable. Counter-value means that you're going after the things that the target finds valuable, like a city and all of the people and wealth inside of that city. The alternative is counter-force targeting, force here meaning the means by which my opponent has to fight a war against me. If we're talking about this in the context of two nuclear states fighting a war against each other, think about what happens if all I do is engage in counter-value targeting. I begin the nuclear war by attacking all of my opponent's cities. What happens next? Well, I didn't do any targeting of my opponent's nuclear forces, which means my opponent still has all of those nuclear forces to fire back at me. Thus, if I want to start a nuclear war, perhaps the first thing that I ought to do is engage in counter-force targeting, destroy all of my opponent's nuclear weapons, and once I am confident that that mission has been completed, I can then target my opponent's cities and beat my opponent into submission with a counter-value targeting. Well, that opens up the possibility of accidental nuclear war. Imagine my opponent is looking at their radars and see that I have launched a whole bunch of nuclear weapons. It is reasonable for them to conclude that I am targeting their own nuclear weapon silos, so that the counter-force targeting gets resolved, they no longer have an ability to fight me, and then I can destroy all of them with free reign. Unfortunately, that means that they are in a use-it-or-lose-it scenario. If they don't fire their nuclear weapons right now, they will never have the opportunity to do so. So the nuclear officials call the head of state, tell him what's happening. The head of state says, yep, go ahead and fire away. And now I have a bunch of nuclear weapons coming at me. Well, what I did not tell you earlier is, in fact, I did not ever fire a nuclear weapon. It was my opponent's radar malfunctioning. But my opponent was unaware that the radar was malfunctioning. They thought it was a legitimate threat and felt that they had no alternative but to fire their nuclear weapons right then and there. And that is how you get accidental nuclear war. One solution to this problem is to just have an abundance of nuclear weapons. If my opponent has so many nuclear weapons that I cannot plausibly destroy all of those nuclear weapons in one fell swoop, then they're not going to feel like they're in a position where they're going to use it or lose it. Maybe they'll have some weapons that are use it or lose it, but as long as there are still a handful that remain and are protected, that is still going to give enough deterrent power to destroy all of my cities, and thereby scaring me into not launching that initial first strike anyway. Perhaps think about that as a long and complicated argument about why nuclear triads are important. Triads protect your second strike capacity, which in turn means that the likelihood of an accidental nuclear war goes down. If we circle back and discuss how this connects to the Golden Dome, remember that the Golden Dome is designed to swat down nuclear weapons before they hit the United States. It is possible that an opponent might be able to overwhelm that system by launching a whole bunch of nuclear weapons at once. But if the United States is able to take out 90% of those nuclear weapons in a first strike, then perhaps the Golden Dome can catch the remaining 10%. Maybe you see where this is going, though. Without the Golden Dome, the opponent is not particularly concerned about a first strike putting all of its nuclear weapons in the use-it-or-lose-it scenario. With the Golden Dome, though, it becomes effectively a use-it-or-lose-it scenario, which increases the risks of a major nuclear attack, not by intention, but by accident. One last point about the United States and coercing its opponents. The US has been engaged in a long-running negotiations with Iran about Iran developing nuclear weapons. If you want to stop a country from developing nuclear weapons, you basically have two options. Option 1 is coercion, and option 2 is concessions. Coercion means many things here. There is a long-running sanctions regime against Iran, as an example. Israel has been involved in all sorts of sabotage operations against Iran's nuclear program. But the thing that's on the minds of a lot of people right now is a military intervention into Iran to physically stop Iran from making progress toward a bomb. Meanwhile, the concession strategy means granting a bunch of benefits to the potential proliferator in an attempt to convince the potential proliferator that developing a nuclear weapon will not provide much more beyond what they are already getting, and not give them much more of what they want, but still come at the cost of developing that project, which is going to be expensive. The downside for the concession strategy is that you are going to have to give up things in negotiations that you are not particularly enthusiastic about. The upshot for the coercion strategy is that if your threat to intervene is credible, you may very well deter the potential proliferator from even trying to develop a nuclear weapon in the first place. So you can get exactly what you want without having to make any concessions, purely out of the threat of using the stick. You don't have to offer any carrots, the stick is enough. But that was all conditional on not only having a credible threat to intervene, but having the potential proliferator think that you have a credible threat to intervene. If that is not the case, and you opt for the coercion strategy, what happens next is the potential proliferator starts developing a nuclear weapon. and what you do next is going to be bad no matter which option you choose. If you do in fact have a credible threat to intervene at that point, and you launch a preventive war, sure, you may stop the potential proliferator from developing a weapon, but it's still not a great outcome for you. You had to pay the costs associated with fighting that preventive war. Meantime, if you choose not to fight a preventive war, perhaps because you view the costs associated with it as too high, what happens next is that the potential proliferator gets nuclear weapons. And then at that point, you're going to be re-entering negotiations against an opponent that has a nuclear weapon and can coerce you with that nuclear weapon, which also does not sound very good. Okay, well, what determines whether you have a credible threat to intervene or not? One major component of that is how much the balance of power will shift once the potential proliferator has acquired a nuclear weapon. If there is going to be a massive shift in the balance of power, suddenly it becomes very reasonable for you to want to fight a preventive war, even if the costs associated with it are very high, precisely because you do not want to give all of that additional coercive power to your opponent. And remember, if all of that is evident to the potential proliferator ahead of time, then the potential proliferator will not try to develop a nuclear weapon in the first place, because they know that doing so invites a preventive war and all of the costs associated with that, in addition to the potential proliferator having invested billions of dollars into a nuclear weapons program that ultimately goes nowhere. So, in sum, if a country like the United States has a clear, credible threat to launch a preventive war against a country like Iran, then the United States gets a really good outcome. It deters Iran from ever trying to develop a nuclear weapon because Iran internalizes the threat of the United States intervening if Iran tried to do that. However, circling back to the Golden Dome, what does the Golden Dome do? It reduces Iran's ability to hit the United States with a nuclear weapon, which means the shift in the balance of power if the United States is capable of developing the Golden Dome isn't actually that large, which seems like a good thing from the United States' perspective, except it sabotages the United States' credible commitment to launching a preventive war against Iran if Iran develops a nuclear weapon. It undermines that deterrent threat. Consequently, we have another mechanism by which having the Golden Dome makes the United States worse off. And that's true even if the Golden Dome were free. Iran feels like it can develop a nuclear weapon without consequence, and while it is true that some of the benefit associated with developing a nuclear weapon is going to be lost from Iran's perspective by the presence of the Golden Dome, it is still getting something out of that, and that is putting the United States in a worse position than if Iran were completely deterred from building that nuclear weapon at all. The one upshot here is that if the United States were to try to go with the concessions route, it becomes a little bit easier to convince Iran not to develop the nuclear weapon by offering concessions now, because the amount of concessions the United States has to give Iran to convince Iran not to build is based on how many benefits Iran expects to receive from developing nuclear weapons. If the Golden Dome is going to cancel out some of those benefits, then Iran finds building nuclear weapons less attractive, and so the United States doesn't need to offer as much to Iran to convince Iran not to build. As such, I take this whole conversation about the Golden Dome to be a weak signal in the direction that the United States is not particularly interested in launching a preventive war against Iran, precisely because this is sabotaging the United States' credibility in doing so, and it's better geared toward convincing Iran not to develop a nuclear weapon via the concessions route. I say it is a weak signal because there are a whole bunch of other signals pointing at the United States perhaps wanting to fight Iran, and the Golden Dome has a whole bunch of purposes that go beyond what's happening with Iran as well that may result in the United States wanting to construct the Golden Dome, even aside from any sort of negative consequences associated with negotiations with Iran. Finally, I have an important note regarding the funding for the Golden Dome. As you watch the sizzle reel one more time, it is easy to forget that the Golden Dome, as it stands currently, is not funded, which is no small issue given how expensive it's going to be to construct. Rather, funding has only passed through the House of Representatives through Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill, which coincidentally is what my college girlfriend used to call me. Actually unlocking the money for the Golden Dome will first require a bill through the Senate, and then the president's signature. As it stands now, there are a ton of objections in the Senate to the One Big Beautiful Bill. Some of those have to do with the amount of money that the Golden Dome is going to require, but there are a whole bunch of other objections to everything else that is in the bill. Remember, it is one big bill, and as a consequence, there's a lot of legislation in there that people in the Senate are not particularly excited about. All that is to say that it may be months before there is any further progress made on this front. As we wait, it is interesting that more countries are not wanting to join along on the project, even conditional on the fact that there are lots of European countries that are not so hot on the Trump administration. Remember that the Golden Dome name is misleading, because this is not a shield around the United States. Rather, this is a cluster of satellites going all around the world, intending to shoot down rockets as they are coming up, basically trying to target them at their source. Consequently, you are looking at a system that is going to be exceptionally expensive to start up by one country. But once the system is set up, using that system to protect other countries requires very little additional costs, because all you are doing is using your existing infrastructure to shoot a missile that comes up. Basically, at that point, you could do it just as easily for anyone else as you could do it for yourself. As a result, looking at this from an economic perspective, if the United States had more partners to help defray the costs, it would be much easier to get the program up and running, and once it is up and running, then a whole bunch of countries beyond the United States would also benefit from it. I mentioned a moment ago that the lack of other partner countries interested in this project is itself interesting, aside from the concerns about the Trump administration. And the reason that I think that this actually has some bite to it is that there has been one country that is discussing this, which is Canada, and Canada is a country that has had a lot of problems with Donald Trump recently. Despite that, Canada is interested in the project. So what does that say about other countries not being interested? Well, this may just be a time thing. We may hear more countries in Europe getting interested in it soon. But if there isn't that same level of interest as what Canada has, then that raises some questions about whether the other countries think that the project is viable, because they would not want to partner with the United States if they just think that this is going to be a money suck. The United States is going to be spending billions of dollars on this project and it's never actually going to work, similar to a repeat of the 1980s. So that is something that I'm going to keep an eye on. How many other countries are interested in joining this project? And if there isn't a lot of discussion around that, then maybe this isn't actually all that viable. Meanwhile, is a second channel of mine viable? I don't know. You tell me. By conditional on enjoying this video, you liking, sharing, and subscribing, and me seeing you next time. Take care.